Hello, welcome back to the show. We are going to play part 2 of the interview with Zain next Monday morning in the ASEAN Breakfast Call. So tune in if you want to watch Zain. And now we have Miss Sumitha, who is from the Bar Council Migrant, Refugees and Immigration Affairs Committee, who advocates for rights protection of non-citizens, and she's also from the Migration Working Group, which is a coalition of about 20 key civil society organizations in Malaysia for rights and protection of non-citizens. So Sumitha, very glad to have you here today. Welcome.
Thank you, Vienna.
Yeah. So perhaps we could start the day with why did you started with advocating for rights of non-citizens?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
I've been working with the Bar Council for the past 7 years, and when this portfolio was given to me, I found it extremely challenging. Challenging because there was no laws, there was no legal framework, and neither were there any solid policies governing the rights of non-citizens. So this is why I took this up as a challenge, and I think that over the years it has become a passion to advocate for the rights of non-citizens.
But why do you feel for them? Because right now in Malaysia, we feel that a lot of people don't really care for non-citizens because especially, we have a lot of them as one of our, how do we put it, domestic workers at home. And it seems like a lot of people feel that they are, let's say, inferior, So what makes you feel for them?
I think what makes me feel for them is they play a part in developing Malaysia. We cannot deny that. They have built our roads. They have built our buildings. For domestic workers that you say they're inferior, if they are not in your homes, you cannot go out and work. Okay, they are playing their part in developing this economy, and their contribution is underrated. And this is why I feel that their rights and protection must be protected. It is important. They are humans as well. I have studied in the West, and I've seen how Malaysians have gone there to work, and how we are looked upon as inferior. Similarly, how we see our fellow Asians here as inferior. But we have contributed to that economy when we work in Western countries. So similarly, when migrants or refugees come to Malaysia and they contribute to the economy, it is important that we recognize them as human beings. It's just as how we wanted us to be recognized by the Western.
Yeah, it's just a kind of treatment that we feel that every human being deserves, because sharing the same experience, I would feel that, to be denied the ability to say work in a country where I would happily labor for and whatnot, and that's very basic, human rights that we are denying to people. Yeah.
So part of advocating for the rights is also educating the public on why we should treat migrants and refugees with respect. I think our mindset about migrants and refugees or non-citizens come from our colonialism days, the master-servant relationship, and we carry on that till now. So whoever I keep in my house and I pay to do my work is actually a servant, and
not a human being.
I can treat not a human being. I can treat him any way I want. So similarly, when migrants come here and we see them, we look at them below. So that's something that we need to change.
And perhaps we'll clarify some of the terms that we use. Migrants refer mostly to those who have permits of working in the country and they come by choice, like Sumitha mentioned earlier. And then refugees are those who the country recognize as how do I put it,
refugees and asylum seekers are persons who escape from their home countries to escape persecution from their own governments or individuals or organizations within their country. So they seek asylum in another country.
Yeah,
that's what refugees are. They don't come by choice, but rather by forced circumstances.
But the difference between asylum seekers and refugees is that asylum seekers are not yet recognized, whereas as refugees you're already recognized.
Yes. So in asylum seekers comes to a country first, and he obtains an interview with the UNHCR. All that stages are considered he's just an asylum seeker. Once he gets a UNHCR card, then he's recognized as a refugee.
But is it guaranteed that he will get a card?
No, that's not guaranteed. Not all persons who seek asylum are given refugee status.
Interesting. So it's say an arbitrary decision.
No, not
some
necessarily.
criteria.
It's the UNHCR, which is the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. They are the ones who are mandated to determine whether a person is a refugee or not. So a lot of background check is done. A lot of their stories are verified before the card can be given.
So Sumitha, maybe it will help for our listeners to have maybe an overview to know what's the picture like in Malaysia.
Okay, maybe to start off, I could give you some statistics. Then we could appreciate the magnitude of the issue here. So according to UNHCR, as at February 2014, there are about 143,000 refugees and asylum seekers registered in Malaysia. And UNHCR says that there are maybe about 35,000 more which have not reached within their premises. So out of this statistics, about 133 are Myanmars. They come from Myanmar. And we have refugees from Sri Lanka, Somalia, Syrians. We have Syrians about 900. And then we have Iraqis, Afghans, and other countries, Pakistan, Nepal, and other countries. So out of this population, about 70% of them are male and 30% are female. And children make up about 30,000 below the age of 18. So this is the statistic picture of Malaysia's refugee population. And we also host the second largest refugee asylum community after Thailand.
So I think that helps for the listeners to understand that Malaysia is seen as a transfer hub, for them to get to a third country that will actually resettle them.
Yeah, the concept of refugees is you leave your country and go to a country that will either host you temporarily or give you some sort of status to stay within the country. Then once you get your UNHCR card, and then you go on for resettlement to another third country that has signed the convention.
And in ASEAN countries is Philippines and Cambodia.
Philippines are the only two countries that have signed the convention. But most of the resettlements of refugees take place in Canada, Australia, US, Western countries.
So how did they end up as refugee or asylum seekers in the first place?
Most of it is due to the home country, the state, not being able to protect its own citizens. So for instance, in the Rohingyas situation, they face a lot of persecution by the government itself, and they are not recognized as citizens of Myanmar, and thus they leave the country because they face harassment, extortion, abuse. So they leave the country for a safer place. And Thailand and Malaysia being closer, they tend to go to Thailand and Malaysia. So that's how they become refugees. There are other ways as well. Either they get political asylum, maybe they are a political party, and they do not get a lot. Yeah, activists. All these people, they fear for their life, and they fear for the life of their families. So that is why they leave. So you have to cross the border to be a refugee.
So I think one very interesting thing is how in Myanmar, for example, a lot of people are being displaced because of a law that was enacted that basically tells you that from now onwards, you are no longer recognized as citizens.
Yes.
And you have to find a way for yourself.
Yeah, there's almost about 600,000 internally displaced persons in Myanmar itself. So the act, the Citizens Act that was enacted, basically made these Rohingyas, stateless overnight. So now the tussle is, the Myanmar says that they are Bangladeshis and they should go back to Bangladesh. And the Bangladeshi government says that no, these people never were born in Bangladesh and we don't recognize them as our citizens. They are your citizens.
They don't even appear on the census.
So in comparison to all the other refugee population in Malaysia, why Rohingyas have it worse is because they are stateless. They don't even have a country to call their own. So this is the problem with the Rohingya population.
And it is because they used to stay in the really interior areas in the past.
Yes, they live within the interior. And even until now, they still remain in the interior. And because of the government's policies, they are not allowed to move out of the interiors. And in fact, their movements are very restricted. They cannot move from one village to another village. They cannot have children without the permission of the government. They cannot marry without the permission of the government. They cannot work without the permission of the government. So this is how they are controlled.
Are they also like systematically trying to? I've seen some videos where they claim that they are trying, the military are trying to systematically exterminate all these minorities.
Yes, that's possibly true. If you have so many policies put in place to control a population, the ultimate goal is actually to exterminate the population.
Right.
So we have a lot of population of Rohingyas outside the country, like Thailand and Malaysia. But when you speak to the Myanmar government, they'll say that they are not our citizens, and they won't welcome them back.
And the fact that all this happened in the interiors means that a lot of people don't even know that it's happening.
Yes, a lot of people don't know. But the last clash between the Rohingyas and the Buddhists that happened in June 2012, that was picked up by satellite. So that is how people got to know.
So how is it like living as a refugee in Malaysia or asylum seeker?
Well, in Malaysia, the refugees tend to concentrate in the urban areas. They live in Johor Bahru, they live in Penang, and they live in Kuala Lumpur. They tend to live in the urban capitals because access to work and access to schools and also easy to find jobs, really. So, and also they can blend into the population. So in the city, the populations are quite large, and so when they live within the population, they're not very visible. But if they go and live in the rural areas, then they become too visible, and that might create more problems for them. So living in the cities is not easy. I mean, even for a Malaysian to live in the city is not easy. Cost of living and all that. So for this refugee and asylum seekers, because their status is not recognized in Malaysia, they have no access to national schools. So they depend on schools run by NGOs as well as refugee communities themselves. Then they don't have access to work. But of course, how do you keep body and soul together if you do not work? So the government closes an eye and allows them to work, but in menial jobs. Maybe odd jobs, cutting grass, working in the restaurant, behind the restaurant, cleaning chicken, onions, things like that. And medical. Those who have the UNHCR card are entitled to medical health, but then they have to pay half the payment of a foreigner, which is also quite high in comparison to a Malaysian because they don't work. Then how do you expect them to pay medical bills? So they are very vulnerable to medical issues, the refugees here. And then we have UNHCR trying to help them. UNHCR only has one office in Kuala Lumpur, and they have to cater to all these 142,000 refugees, which is actually a task for them. It's a great task for them to actually manage this community. So this is why we have NGOs, the refugee committee themselves, helping one another.
I've also talked to one of the refugees from Middle East in Malaysia before. He talked about how after a few years, he's still waiting for his interview with UNHCR, and also how he gets harassed by the authorities all the time. How is it like?
Well, as soon as an asylum seeker comes to the UNHCR, because if you see the population, the UNHCR has only one office in Kuala Lumpur, and it has a strained budget. It has very little manpower. Hence, their first interview might be 2 years. They might give a date 2 years onwards. So they have to wait in Malaysia for 2 years before they can even have their first interview, on average. So during this time, they are very, very vulnerable.
He told me that even if he has an UNHCR card, it still does not guarantee him from not being harassed by authorities and trying to get, how do I put it? They would try to capture or arrest him, and he will only get off by paying them an amount of money.
Yes, those kind of news have come to our attention because the Malaysian government does not recognize refugees. I told that from the start. They don't recognize refugees. So when they get the card, the perception of the police or whoever is arresting them will say that this card is fake. I need to verify whether you are a refugee. So what they do is they take them into detention, because you can only verify with the UNHCR. So they cannot verify on the spot. So they will take them into detention and then inform UNHCR, look, there is a person here who claims that he's a refugee. He has a card. Can you tell us whether this person is a refugee? Sometimes that news gets to the UNHCR quick, within a week. But at times it takes sometimes months. So the asylum seeker or the refugee sometimes stays in the detention center maybe for about 2 months.
Hopefully there isn't death in detention yet.
Well, we have actually had deaths in detention.
Okay.
Because detention is not a place that everyone wants to be. It's not sanitary wise. It's not very good. So we do have deaths in detention.
Maybe a quick way to fix that is having an electronic database of sorts that they could check.
Yeah, that's possibly one way. But then there is also the confidentiality issue. So when refugees' information is taken by the UNHCR, by right, it's confidential. It's not to be shared with other agencies, because that may also open to abuse. Right? So what, of course, we advocate ultimately is for the Malaysian government to sign the Convention on Refugees and open up a system that the Malaysian government can regulate the entry and the living conditions of the refugees. But the Malaysian government is very skeptical and does not want to sign the convention, solely on the basis that if I do, then I will have a horde of refugees on my shore the next day.
Right.
Which actually is, I think that can be debunked, because if you see country like Japan, it has signed the convention, and the state does the refugee status determination, and has only about 2,000 refugees. So that theory is not right. You see, from our point of view, if you sign a convention, you can actually have the mechanics around it. So that's what it should be. But unfortunately, the Malaysian government is still reluctant.
I'm curious, is it because Japan is so far away, that's why that they only get 2,000, and then Malaysia might be just flooded,
Well, not necessarily. Japan has 2,000 because the state runs the refugee status determination system, and it's very strict. Okay. It has the resources, it has the manpower to do a good job. In this case, in Malaysia, it's the UNHCR that runs the refugee status determination system, and it does not have the manpower, and neither does it have the resources.
For example, for Japan to accept me as a refugee, do I have to have certain kind of skill sets? And
well, it's not refugees has nothing to do with skills.
Right.
It's you have to show that you are persecuted by your government or by someone back home, and it is not safe for you to go back home. That's what you must show. It's got nothing to do whether you have skills or not. Well, in fact, coming back to that same point that you made, one of the arguments that we always tell the government here is, if you do not give the refugees here the opportunity to gain education, skills, then the resettlement is going to be affected. It's going to take longer, because third world countries like Australia, third countries like Australia, US and all that will want to take refugees who can contribute to the economy.
Yep. So
if you have a population that is illiterate, has no skills at all, so how do you expect them to take these refugees? It's not practical. Okay, so this is why we're trying to tell the Malaysian government, you have to allow them to gain the skills, gain the education, and then they have a better chance to move.
So we should work together to help.
Definitely.
Yeah, as because most of the refugees do come from the ASEAN region in Malaysia.
Yes.
We'll be sharing more after the break. Hello, welcome back to the show. And now we'll move on to discover a little about what the progress is currently, with regards to with regards to the issues of human trafficking in Malaysia. Yeah. Okay. So human trafficking in Malaysia, it's a result of all these refugees who ended up in Malaysia, and because of that, there's a lot of inbound and outbound refugees in Malaysia. So,
we wouldn't say that all refugees are trafficked. Some come on their own, but then because they are a vulnerable community, so they are prone to trafficking. So, example, when in Myanmar, I take Myanmar as an example. So when Myanmar has all these policies against its citizen, it pushes its citizens out of the country. So Rohingyas leave the country because they cannot live in Myanmar. And the only way of coming out of the country is either they seek a smuggler, a syndicate, or they get someone's help to come out of the country. So then they're trafficked out. Some of them are smuggled. When we say smuggled, there's a lot of difference between smuggling and trafficking. Some of them are smuggled, they pay their way out, and then they end up in Thailand or in Malaysia. But when they are trafficked, most probably they are kept in captivity, forced into labor or something like that, and forced to pay more money, exploited, things like that. So then they come over to Malaysia and Thailand. Unfortunately, the governments in the region always see that refugees are linked to trafficking, which actually is not the case. Refugees leave the country because they have no choice, and they seek avenues to go out of the country. And so happens traffickers are there to provide that avenue. So, example, we have the Bali process, which is initiated by the Australian and within the region. And at the last Bali process, the emphasis was on not tackling human trafficking, but how do we stop the boat arrivals coming to Australia? That was the focus, which is actually quite sad because everybody was talking about how we're going to prevent refugees from coming onto the boat. No one actually talked about how are we going to prosecute the smugglers? How are we going to take effective steps to stop trafficking syndicates? Or how are we going to stop the problems happening in the countries that are forcing the refugees out of the countries? So these were all not addressed. So the Bali process, for me, my personal view, it is a failure because it does not address the root of the problem, the root cause of the problem.
But I also noted that some developments that I've seen on the side of Australia so far is that a few weeks ago they even held a Candlelight Vigil it's a photo shared by the Asylum Seekers Resource Center that I've also circulated on my Facebook, talking about how compassion is now trending in Twitter in Melbourne because of this Candlelight Vigil that's attended by thousands of people in Melbourne, where they advocate for the rights of asylum seekers in Australia. So is it fair to say that there are some progress in development, whether is it in other countries beyond ASEAN or even countries in ASEAN countries?
I think it's safe to say that contrary to popular belief, not all Australians are against refugees.
Yep.
So photos such as these are posted by groups that are sympathetic, empathetic as well to refugee plight. So there is a small population in Australia who want to advocate for the rights and protection of refugees.
Yeah, sorry, you can look at these pictures with hashtag Light the Dark.
Yeah. So, but this is a NGO-initiated Candlelight Vigil. It's not a government-initiated Candlelight Vigil. Okay. Government policies in Australia are very much against refugees. So, we would like to see more of this. And of course, we'd like to see government showing more empathy and sympathy towards refugees. But that's something that needs to go on.
So what can we do, as people, common people from the grassroots? What can ASEAN community and the international community do to help this situation?
I think in a ground level, just like you and I think the only thing we can do is actually to treat them with respect. Understand why refugees have left the country and come here. Be empathetic to their plight. There are a lot of NGOs here who help refugees with their daily needs, but then there's also constraint. There are a lot of churches that help refugees as well. So even if you do not want to help, you do not want to extend a hand of, but I think what you could do is not harass them, not shun them, but treat them like equal human beings. That's something I think you and I can do. If you want to do something more than that, you can always contact the NGOs who work with refugees.
Who are they? No.
There are plenty. There's health equity initiatives, Tenaganita. These are the groups that work. The Archdiocese in Kuala Lumpur, the church. All these groups work with refugees. They either give them counseling, they provide them free English lessons. So if you want to volunteer, there are lots of ways to do that.
Can you be a teacher at refugee schools?
Yes, you can do that. The refugee communities themselves run schools, but they're always short of teachers. They're always short of teachers who can teach English, because they themselves do not know English, so they need to find somebody local to teach English, maths, science, things like that. So you can volunteer time there. On a larger level, advocating. If you are part of an organization or even a corporation, you can take this up as a corporate social responsibility, a CSR project, helping a refugee community. Usually CSRs always talk about wanting to donate to children's home or old folks home, but this community is also one such vulnerable group where it can be part of your CSR. So corporations can do that. Of course, on a bigger picture, on the ASEAN level, the developments that we have seen is governments have started to speak out and have told Myanmar that they have to do something about their citizens, about the problems that are internal problems in the country, because Myanmar is not addressing the problems within in the country. Their citizens are leaving, and nations around Myanmar are hosting the Myanmaris. So there has been some sort of push for Myanmar to do something, solve your internal problems, give them their rights. Even if they're minorities, they must have some basic rights. Like how Malaysians, even though we are minorities, we have some sort of basic right in Malaysia. Right to education, right to medical health, right to work. So this is something we have, and this is the same thing that we ask, the same right for Myanmaris in Myanmar. And Myanmar is the chair of the ASEAN for 2014. So we hope to see Myanmar's leadership in this issue. This is a very contentious issue, and it's a bone of contention for Myanmar for a very, very long time.
Right.
For many years, Myanmar did not see progress, did not see investors in the country because it had all these problems. And now it has opened up its country. But that doesn't mean that all these problems should be swept away. You have to deal with it. So investors are also quite smart. They want to see progress in Myanmar, as in development in Myanmar, but they also want to see some human rights policies in Myanmar.
Why would human rights be of interest to investors?
Most of the investors are companies, and companies have code of conducts, and they have their own guidelines on labor rights, on their own family social rights and all that. So companies like huge companies, like example like Nike or apparel companies, if they want to invest in Myanmar, they want to open up a factory in Myanmar, they have to follow the same code of conduct. So they can't go to a country which violates all human rights, but it has a company in a country that has all the rights. And you must know that it will export all these products from a country in Myanmar to its country. So people have this, there is some sort of trend now that when they buy a product, when people buy a product, especially in the West, they want to know where it came from. They want to know who made it, what were the labor rights of these people who made it. So this is why it's all linked up. We have had some successes where the parent company has imposed some sort of rules and regulations on countries in ASEAN states and says that I don't think your labor rights are enough for your workers. You have to have this kind of labor rights. Only then I will take your products. So we can see this kind of trend happening now. So we hope that this is the path that the investors take when they deal with Myanmar. I want to see some human rights in your country. Only then I will invest in your country. Only then I will open a factory in your company, in your country, and I will provide work for your citizens. So that should be the way.
But I think that there is also this huge argument against even the concept of human rights, not being part of the Asian values. It's spurred by, say, one of our prime ministers, Mahathir, in the past, where he argues that Asian values or ASEAN values are different, and also in ASEAN, it seems like there is this ASEAN way where it's human rights. It's not necessarily something that they will advocate for exactly like what the Western companies or the Western world would advocate for. So if a lot of investment in ASEAN now actually comes from China, so how would they be practicing human rights?
Most of the ASEAN countries are very, very scared of the word human rights.
Yeah,
because they think it's a Western concept. And they always say that we cannot adopt this human rights concept in ASEAN because we have, like what you say, our Asian values, cultures. But I think they have got it wrong, because human rights does not mean that I can say and do anything I want. That's not what human right is. Human right gives me the freedom to say what I want, but with responsibilities. So long as what I say does not hurt another. Because the other person also has human rights as well. So my human rights must not impede another person's human rights. That's what human rights should be about. So I think the problem here in ASEAN countries is they are not used to their citizens speaking up. I tell you, listen. That's what we learn in school. Teacher tells you, listen. You do not question the teacher. We do not have any critical thinking skills. So when a citizen questions policies, government policies and all that, the government becomes defensive. Or this person is against national security and all that. So this is why it gets scared of that word, human rights. But it should not be. It should be happy that there is a citizen out there is actually questioning and worried about the progress of the country and wants to see better things in the country. That's what the government should encourage, that the nation and the people partake in what's happening in the country. Not just live for yourself, but live for the nation as well.
I will agree with that, and also how it is not because that we don't like the country, that's why we are protesting. In fact, it's the opposite. It is out of love, that we're actually sticking out and risk being sent in exile as refugees in other countries by speaking out, especially in a lot of ASEAN countries where, the tradition seems to be a top-down, authoritarian, and respect is very important. But is there a certain validity in saying that maybe community interest is more important than individual interests and individual human rights, and we should care more about, let's say, economic stability and of the whole than you being able to speak whatever you want?
Well, that's true. But then there's always this argument that which community are you talking about? Are they the majority? Because when society speaks, the government says that, oh, you're the minority. But when the government speaks, it always says that I'm the majority. But it might not be so. Maybe the government's view is the minority. We do not know that. So to say that the community interest is above individuals, I think it depends on the subject matter, really. we have rights of assembling and all that, then you can see a large section of people coming for rallies and things like that. Do we consider them the majority? But then the government may argue, no, they're the minority because we have 28 million people, but only 250,000 came for the rally. But then we could also say that 250,000 people maybe represented 20 million people. Maybe they couldn't come for whatever reason. So we represented them.
I should add that in the Peaceful Assembly Act in Malaysia, it states that if you are a non-citizen, you do not have the right to assemble. And if you are, then you are arrested, you are fined and jailed and whatnot.
Yeah, okay.
So that's it. And so I guess the problem with government in ASEAN is that they should realize that we are all interconnected and we should be starting to work as one, especially with the coming of the ASEAN Economic Community.
Yes.
It's this issue about asylum seekers, of migrants, refugees is going to come up more and more, and you cannot stop things from entering your border and practice a different kind of policy, I guess, with non-interference and whatnot, because this is not just going to work together.
Yeah. ASEAN countries really should rethink its policy on the principle of non-interference. That is a principle that is impeding every progress in ASEAN. Example, this refugee issue that you're talking about. Why we see a reluctance from ASEAN countries to give a harder push to Myanmar is because of this principle of non-interference. Example, even when we had our own invasion by the Sulu, why did the other governments did not interfere? It's because it's an internal matter. So the principle of non-interference in ASEAN is very, very strong. So they do not question human rights violations in other countries.
Yes.
So if they have to rethink that policy. Only then we can work together and find a regional solution to the refugee problem, as well as other problems as well. So yeah, economy is important. It helps develop countries, but then ultimately it's the people that matters as well. There's no point you having all beautiful buildings, beautiful landscape and all that, but the people within that society is suffering. I think it's pointless.
How does EU treat its refugees and asylum seekers if there's many? And also, are you advocating for us to follow the EU model?
EU countries, because they have signed the Refugee Convention, so that's the difference. Once you sign the Refugee Convention, you will put in a mechanics to deal with refugees. So they have, when they come in, the government will determine their status for a refugee, and then they will give them right to work, right to start a family, right to housing, right to education. All that will be looked after by the state. So that's how it differs from countries in ASEAN, because we don't have that. So EU, that's why people flock to these countries to seek asylum. And when they do, they're pretty much settled in the country. And then years to come, they will get citizenship in that country. But ASEAN, because we have no one here who signed except Philippines and Cambodia, who host a very small population of refugees. So we have all these problems, all these social problems, all this arbitrary arrest, and these kind of things. This because we don't have any legal framework to deal with refugees in the country. And there's no effort by the government to deal with them because they are hoping that they will disappear one day. But I don't think that they are going to disappear, because we have seen refugees living here for past 30 years. They are part of the society already, living in, maybe in invisible, but they are part of the society. And I think that it's about time the government accepts that the refugees are here to stay.
Hello, welcome back. And now Miss Sumitha is here with us still, and she'll be talking a little about the migrant issue in Malaysia.
Okay, so the migrant population, like what we mentioned earlier, they come to work. They come by choice. So most probably their country does not have enough employment, and they seek a better life for their families. So they come out of the countries to work. In Malaysia, the statistics given by the government is about 2% 2.3 million migrants in Malaysia. And we think that there's an equal number of undocumented migrants. So registered migrants, most probably 2.3 million. Equally, we have about 2 million unregistered migrants, undocumented migrants.
And these are statistics from the government.
Yeah.
Let's note that, because I think I was also asking Miss Sumitha about whether we have accounted for the population in Sabah, the migrants and whatnot.
This is just Peninsular Malaysia.
Yeah, so the actual figure could be way more than that.
Yes.
A few millions more than that.
So the migrants come here to work. So the Employment Act 1955 recognizes migrants and its labor rights. That's very clear in Malaysia. So, and then you'll think that, so why are we having all these problems? What's the problem with migrants if they have all their labor rights? It's easy to say that they have their labor rights, but then it's immigration policies that do not allow them to access these rights. Example, when a migrant comes into the country, his passport, or rather his work permit, is attached to the employer. So his employer is named on the work permit. And say suppose the employer does not pay him a salary, abuses him, he cannot leave that employer and go to another employer to work, because his permit says that you can only work with this employer. So if he wants to leave and work with another employer, he has to go back to his country and apply afresh for a work permit and come back to the country. So that's the problem here. So once you have somebody who is tied down to a employer, the employer says that, okay, whatever I do, this guy will not run away. So that's how the abuse starts. They won't pay salary. They will take away their passport. They won't give them food, housing. So we have these kind of problems. And migrants, because they come from poor backgrounds, they are unskilled or semi-skilled. They come from poor background. They come from villages in part of India or Pakistan, or all these places where they have nothing. Just to come to Malaysia, they will sell whatever they have, their land, their house, take loans from money lenders, and they will incur huge debts at home before they come to this country, hoping that I will earn enough to send back to my family. But we have a study was conducted to show that a migrant cannot earn enough for the first 2 years. The first 2 years that they earn is only used to pay up all its debts. Only after 2 years that they start earning to send money back home. So, coming back to the problems that the migrants face here, one is that the work permit is attached to the employer. Secondly, access to labor courts. Say suppose a migrant wants to file a complaint. What happens is the employer goes to the labor department, or the immigration department, and unilaterally cancels its work permit. So this migrant has no work permit. So it becomes undocumented. So when he goes to court, he has to get a special pass from the immigration. And that special pass costs him 100 ringgit every month for 3 months. During the 3 months that he's here, he cannot work. The special pass prohibits employment. So how do you expect the migrant worker to live in this country without working and pursue a labor case? It is not possible. And cases in a labor court take a long time, more than 3 months. Average, it takes about 9 to 2 years. So how do you expect 9 months to 2 years?
And they have to pay 100 ringgit a month? Once?
No, 100 every month.
Oh, wow.
100 every month to renew. But that special pass can only be renewed at 3 months first.
Okay.
After that is the discretion of the immigration officer whether it renews. Say suppose the immigration officer says, no, I cannot renew. Then the migrant worker has to find a local person to sponsor his stay here. So how many local persons can do that? To sponsor a migrant worker to stay here? Like to act as a guarantor for the migrant worker to stay here and pursue the cases. So what does the migrant usually do when it has a dispute is that they will go to some NGOs and ask and tell the NGOs, look, this person has not paid me for 3 months or 6 months when I need my money. So it becomes more like a negotiation. So the NGO will go to the employer and say, look, this guy needs money. Could you pay? How much can you pay? And he says, oh, I can only pay him. Maybe he owes him about 10,000. He said, no, I can only pay him about 3,000.
Okay.
That's all they'll take and go back home. So a lot of migrants either will take the money, but remain in the country and remain undocumented and continue working in other sectors, or they will return back home. But most of them do not return back home because they have a family back home waiting for them, sending money. They have debts back home that they need to pay, so that they cannot go back. So this is how we have a undocumented population of migrants here. So this is something that also, again, the government has not addressed. We have time and time again mentioned to the government that it has to have some sort of policy in helping the migrants that come to the country, prosecuting employers who violate the rights of migrants. But so far we have not seen much progress. They're very happy to have the migrants here because they build our roads, build our buildings, but they do not want to look into their welfare. That's pretty sad.
And this is also causing some tension between Indonesia and Malaysia.
Yes, of course. I mean, if a Malaysian goes overseas and gets abused, won't you feel, some sort of, they're abusing our nationals? It's the same feeling that other countries will have. So, but then, if Malaysia follows this trend, carries on with this trend, I feel that in years to come, we may not have many migrants here because there are other countries within the region who are taking Indonesians, like Hong Kong, Taiwan. They are taking Singapore. Singapore. They're taking in workers, and they're giving a better pay and all that. So of course the migrants, possibly better rights. So then we may see we may not see a migrant population here in Malaysia for years to come if we carry on with this trend.
And also in the ASEAN Economic Community 2015, it also specifically states skilled labor is the one where free movement is allowed.
Yeah, so that skilled labor actually has been interpreted as professionals.
Yep.
It excludes the migrant community, which is actually quite sad.
Thank you very much, Ms. Sumitha, for sharing with us today.
Thank you.
And we'll hope to see you again in the show.
And thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Have a great day, everyone.